I'd like to take a moment to introduce our lead meditation person and today's speaker. Mike McKinney is here. He's from Jackson. He's been a friend of mine for a number of years now, in which I am very grateful for. He's happily married with 4 children and 9 grandchildren. He has taught in the public schools here in the community for 36 years, retired about 8 years ago, and fills his time traveling, being with family, and doing lots and lots of volunteer work. Since childhood, Mike has always sensed something bigger than himself and something that was moved by love and wants to be a part of that and be an example and a bringer of that to others. One important way of us being with each other is to show that life matters, and this has been an important theme in Mike's life and in his volunteer work. We're happy to have you here today, Mike. Thank you for coming. All right, so.
For the meditation today, I'd like to practice something called Tonglen, which is something, the last time I was here, I led us through that practice as well. And it's a practice where we learn to empathize with one another. And actually, a lot of times the person that we need to empathize with is ourselves. A lot of times we are very critical of ourselves. And so this practice, we can practice on ourselves, we can practice on people that we don't know or people that we do. And as is my habit, a lot of times I'll find something that works for me, and it works for me so well that I forget to do it anymore. So this is also a reminder for me. And there are 4 steps in this. The first step is basically that we clear our minds as best we can, which, as we know, is not easy, but we clear it to the degree that we can. The second is that we think of an issue, a problem, that either we have or that we are concerned about someone else. Maybe they're in the process of loss, or maybe we are. Maybe they're in the process of grief for a job or whatever, a relationship. They might just even be upset that day. You know, we're in line with the cashier, and the cashier is kind of grouchy. We don't know why. But rather than react back to them, we move to a position of empathy. So we think about texture in the second step. What do they feel like? What do they think they're feeling? Feeling of closed in? Feeling of darkness? What is it a black feeling? What is it that what's the texture in that? And we imagine that. Step number 3 is we breathe in whatever we think is the issue. We breathe in that despair. And what we breathe out is what we think is going to help get us through that, get them through that. You know, feeling of peace, a feeling of comfort, whatever we think they're going to need to get past that. And the 4th step is we expand that to the entire universe. Whoever in this world feels that way, we try to breathe in their feeling and breathe out what we think will be their release. So I'll lead us through those 4 steps. But first, think of a person, whether it's yourself or someone else, and a specific problem that they may be going through. And now breathe in and breathe out, just listening to your breath, just clearing your mind. And now think of the texture. Think of what they may be seeing internally or feeling internally. And as we imagine that feeling for ourselves, breathe that in and breathe out what you think might be necessary for release, whether it's peace or joy or calm. And finally, for whoever in this world might be suffering from that same thing, breathe in the texture, breathe out the release. And then a final cleansing breath for yourself. Thank you. Tonglen is a practice that you can do when you're going in the store. You can do it at your house, you can do it in the quiet, you can do it when you're in the middle of a crowd. It's for you, it's for people that you meet. I wanted to talk today about the practice of listening and what listening does, not only for the person who's being listened to, but for us as we listen to them. And Teresa was talking about zeal, and one of the definitions that she had sent me about zeal, including the willingness to move forward. It's not this necessarily great enthusiastic thing, it's this willingness to move forward, to get to know one another. I met someone a couple of years ago who I was looking for a group, my wife and I were looking for a group of people that would be somewhat like-minded and in search of faith. And we were in chairs, and he was very concerned about whether we would be comfortable, my wife and I, being new to that group. And so he made sure that we had everything we needed. He made sure we understood what was going on and so on. And I thought he just seemed like a nice guy that I wanted to get to know. And so I asked him, would you be interested in going out for a cup of coffee? Well, sure, he said he would. And we got out there, and he told me a little bit about himself, and I started telling him a little bit about myself. And he said, now, wait a minute. Every second of the day, there are billions and billions of stories out there. We don't have time to hear each other's stories. What is it that you want? Well, that friendship lasted for about another 20 minutes, and then that's good. But I've thought a lot how much he's missing when we don't take the time to listen to other people's stories, how much we're missing, not only in the people's stories, but in our own ability to grow. If we really believe that we're all connected, that we're all one, why would you not want to know who we're connected with? And if everybody's health, if the community's health is dependent on each individual's health, why would we not be concerned about how they're doing? For me, listening is a creative force. It kind of grows, it expands, it helps me to understand who I am. And for me personally, when I'm listened to, that force seems to grow, it seems to come alive. And when I'm not listened to, it seems to wither. It seems to shrivel a little bit. And I know that a lot of times we can say how we feel and what we think about ourselves should not be dependent on what anybody else does. And yes, okay, I can buy that, I can believe that in my head, but in my heart, it means a lot to know that there's somebody out there that cares enough. There's a book, and it's called The Sacred Art of Listening. And there's a piece in there that I've thought about over and over and over again, and I've tried to practice it. And she says, the author, that the more we listen, the less we fear. And the less that we fear, the more that we trust. And the more that we trust, the more we're able to open up ourselves to each other in love. The more we fear, the less we fear, the more we trust. The more we trust, the more we're able to open ourselves up to each other in love. And that begins with listening. And I've thought about times in my life and places where I've been, things that I do, in which that is very true. One of those being that I go into the prison, and and we have a little bit of a prison in reach, and it's more to make connections, to help bring people back into the community. The one guy that I visit, and we're only allowed to visit one in the state of Michigan. You can't visit more than one unless they're family members. This guy gets himself into more and more trouble, even while he's in prison. And this COVID that started, so that he's without visitors, has made it worse, because there's nobody to listen to him. Richard Rohr, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he's a priest. He says that he's been visiting people in prison for 14 years. He no longer does, but for 14 years he did that. And without exception, he says, every man and every woman that he's ever visited in prison has a similarity, and that is that their same sex, their same gender parent never really sat down with them to tell them how valuable they are. Every single one that he visited for 14 years, their same gender parent never really sat down with them to tell them how valuable they are. And so he always made sure that he did that. And when I visit with Sean, I try to do that. I try to listen to him and get him to listen to me. You're valuable. You're worth spending time with. As a teacher, I would hear that over and over from the kids, what problems that they're facing, and they weren't complaining, but there were kids that didn't know whose house they were going home to that night, whether it was moms or dads or grandmas or if they were even wanted. I can't imagine that. I can't imagine being in that same position. But what they needed was for somebody to hear that. One time when I was visiting Sean in prison, they've got this lounge and very little reading material, but they had a Reader's Digest, and I picked it up and I found a story in there that was so amazing to me that I looked it up and listened to this person that basically the story was about. And her name is Auburn Sandstrom. And she spoke at the Moth one night. The Moth is a story hour where people tell their own stories. And I'm going to edit this story for you, but it was a great reminder to me of why I visit Sean, a great reminder to me of what people need, and it brought to me a better idea of what I need, of how I need to grow by being a part of a community that listens, that cares, and not only being the one that listens, but the one, if I can make myself share so that I can be heard, and what happens when I am and what happens when I'm not heard. So Auburn, I keep wanting to call her Amber. Auburn was a 29-year-old woman, very smart, very accomplished. She actually teaches down at University of Michigan now. Master's degree at the age of 20, before she turned 25, she had her master's degree, all kinds of money. She moved to Ann Arbor. That's where she became acquainted with poverty and misery, and not on her own, but she saw it, discrimination. And so she decided that she was going to deny her own privilege and try to become an activist. And as an activist, she met this poet. And the poet introduced her to another guy that had an association with drugs. And so Auburn started taking these drugs. She had a son, a little baby, and Auburn went deeper and deeper and deeper into these drugs until she got to the point where she'd be driving down the highway with her baby in the back seat, feeding him chocolate, trying to keep him quiet, while she was taking the drugs in this front seat, going down the highway at 70 miles an hour, 75, 80 miles an hour. She was completely lost. So one night, she's in her apartment, and she has this piece of paper that she's got in her hand, and she's folding it and unfolding it. She's absolutely miserable. She's terrified because of what's happening to her body right now. Her husband, the poet, has gone out into the streets trying to find some drugs. Auburn is certain that even if he does, he's going to use it himself. She's feeling completely abandoned. But on this sheet of paper, she has the phone number that her mother sent her 3 or 4 years ago of a Christian counselor, and a little note that says, call this counselor if you ever need help. And this night, she has no idea what to do other than to call this counselor. It's about 2 a.m. She calls him up. And she says, I know it's late, but my mom gave me your number to talk to if I ever needed help, and I need help tonight. So she can hear him now sitting up in bed, pulling the covers up, turning the radio off that's in the room. It was probably his sleep music or something. And he says, yes, tell me what's going on with you. And so she starts talking about her husband a little bit and saying, I love my husband. I don't want you to say anything bad about him, but he does hit me. He has pushed me out and my son in the cold, in the snow, and locked the door. It's not been an easy life for her. And she says she has never opened up like this before. And he's saying, tell me more. Go ahead, tell me more. And she's feeling how present he is in this whole situation. The presence of this man that she's never met, and his interest. And time goes on, hours go by, and she just opens up more and more and more. And all he does is listen and encourage. Sun comes up, and she says, now they've been talking for 4 or 5 hours, and she says, you know, I don't care what religion you are, but I know that you're a Christian counselor, and if you have scripture verses or something for me that you'd like me to read, I'll read them. I will. And he says, don't worry about that. Let's keep talking. And so they did. And again, it comes around. And she says, I really mean it. If you have scripture that you would like me to read, I will. And he says, Auburn, I need you to promise me something. Promise that you will not hang up. And she says, I won't. He says, you called the wrong number. He was not this Christian counselor. He was this person like any of us who got a wake-up call at 2 in the morning from a person that was in need, and what she needed was to be listened to. And he did that with complete presence, without judgment. And she said, in her story, she says she never got his name. She never called him again. She never really took his advice because that wasn't the important thing. But I do want you to hear what she did say. These are her exact words. But the next day, I felt this kind of joy, like I was shining. I think I've heard them call it the peace that passes understanding. I'd gotten to see that there was this completely random love in the universe, that it could be unconditional, and that some of it was for me. This is what I know. In the deepest, blackest night of despair, if you can get just one pinhole of light, all of grace rushes in. I had gotten to see that there was this completely random love in the universe, that it can be unconditional, and that some of it was for me. And whether we agree with her theology or not isn't the point. How did she experience that completely random love and understand that some of it was for her? Because somebody like us, completely present, listened to her. I think of times in my life when I could really experience what she's talking about and how important it is to know that there's somebody there that cares, that listens, that loves. And it encourages me to be that same kind of person. And it doesn't need to be this great event. People around us need to be heard. And we're capable of doing that. And when we do that, we become community. I think it's very true that the more we listen, the less we fear. The less we fear, the more we trust. And the more we trust, the more we can open our hearts to each other in love. Amen.